Hello and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we both did and did not cover in this episode. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Sharon Joe.
And I am your other host, Andrei Kurenkov. Before we get going, actually, let's take a look and give a shout out to our most recent reviews. We've had a couple. One of them, I think we mentioned last time, commented on the audio quality of my recording. And so I actually tweaked it to improve it. So that was really helpful. And then
Significant improvement. Beautiful.
Yeah. And then you got some comments.
Me. Definitely was not me. Just kidding. It wasn't me.
It was. No, you don't care.
Wow.
It's only for the connoisseurs of audio quality who can tell. But no, it was actually not great, so I do appreciate it. And then we also saw a review by a person who is finishing up their PhD in data science and focuses on practical AI ethics, and says that it not only helped with keeping up with the developments in AI, but also with their area of interest. So that's really cool. And just one more, actually, this last week, we got a review from someone who's working on a transmedia story called Gaia's Seeds, all about kind of at the end of the 21st century, much of humanity has handed over its free will to an evolving AI named AGNS, Artificial General Intelligence Neural Earth Systems, which is a pretty cool name. And yeah, apparently this is a good resource to help, study for creating that creative work. So that's really cool to hear as well. So that's all just to say we really do appreciate hearing your feedback and what you like and how it helps you and so on. So we would love it if you leave some reviews on Apple Podcasts, and we will keep checking in to see what you say.
That's right.
And that being said, let's start. So let me give an overview of what we'll be talking about. In applications in business, we'll be talking about using machine learning to identify undiagnosable cancers and how North American companies are spending a lot on robots. In research, we'll talk about using AI to decode speech from brain activity and using robots to assess children's mental well-being. We'll then talk about policy and societal impacts, with France putting healthcare at the heart of its $1.8 billion AI strategy. And also a review that found a paucity of robust evidence on impact of AI on clinical outcomes. Lastly, we'll chat about our art and fun stuff section, and we'll have a couple stories about using AI to generate and create music with two different artists who actually have used it pretty extensively. So that will be a lot of fun. All right, lots to talk about. So let's dive straight in with application in business and using machine learning to identify undiagnosable cancers. So in rare cases, it turns out that the origin of a cancer cannot be determined, even with a lot of testing. And they tend to be aggressive, but the oncologist must treat them with non-targeted therapies, which are let's say unpleasant, have harsh toxicities, and have low rates of survival. So a new deep learning approach developed by researchers at the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research at MIT can help classify these cancers by taking a look at the gene expression programs related to early cell development and differentiation. And we'll discuss what that is a bit. So this paper is Developmental Deconvolution for Classification of Cancer Origin and was published in Cancer Discovery. To go into a little bit of detail, this has to do with how, if you look at cancer cells, they look and behave differently from normal cells, but now there's techniques called single cell profiling, which can actually catalog different cell expression patterns in these like cell atlases, which are really big data sets of how cells are. And so they looked into the early developmental stages of when embryo cells developed and undifferentiated cells specialized into various organs. There's a lot of stuff that happens. And researchers used two large cell atlases, the Cancer Genome Atlas and the Mouse Organogenesis Cell Atlas, with just a bunch of tumor types and trajectories of embryonic cells. And we're able to get a pretty nice model that does a better job using machine learning.
What's really exciting is that they had some pretty impressive results here. They applied the model to 52 new samples that were particularly challenging cancers, and particularly challenging for humans to diagnose. But and to be clear, they were actually so challenging. They were the most challenging seen at MGH over 4 years. From 2017 to 2021, which is crazy. But what's really awesome is that the model was able to classify the tumors into those 4 different categories and have predictions that were able to guide diagnosis at the very least in treatment. And so one example, came from a patient who had history of breast cancer and who was showing signs of cancer in fluid spaces around the abdomen, but the oncologist actually couldn't find the tumor mass initially and just couldn't classify the cancer cells using the tools they had at the time. But this model was able to strongly predict ovarian cancer, and that's huge. And 6 months after the patient first came in, the mass was finally found in the ovary that proved to be the origin of the tumor. So this is kind of a big deal, especially using that test set as a case, as different cases. And so I'm very excited to see where this goes. I've had friends, I've lost friends from cancer. And it was because it wasn't, caught early enough.
Yeah. I think so many people, it's, one of the leading causes of death. And even if this is somewhat rare of not being able to diagnose, clearly this is pretty important. The researchers say that in future work, they plan to increase the predictive power by incorporating other types of data. So not just this cell trajectory stuff, but also radiology, microscopy, and other things, so that you could really combine multiple things and make predictions better. So still research stage, but really exciting, and hopefully something that will be usable, by doctors in the near future.
And on to our next article. North American companies send in the robots even as productivity slumps. North American companies now have set a record of robots in the first half of this year in terms of bringing them in as companies struggle to keep their factories, keep their warehouses running, especially as the labor market tightens even further, and also, compensation costs increase as well. So what does that mean? That's 12,305 machines in the second quarter that were valued at $585 million and 25% more units, that is, than the same period about a year ago. And so this is data from the Association for Advancing Automation. And this is probably the best first half of the year ever, combining that second quarter with the first quarter this year. So this is actually quite big for automation, for robotics. And just to give a couple more stats, there are nearly 2 open jobs for every unemployed worker. So that means there's a lot of room for automation. Employers are now bidding up wages as a result, surging like 5% year over year in the second quarter. And this is the most since the Labor Department began tracking it in 2001, the most ever since then, which is crazy. But robots, don't cost nearly as much, and we can manufacture more and more of them. So big deal here for robotics as it continues to surge, probably in part, because of the pandemic for causing this initial action of a tighter workforce and a need for automation.
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely in yeah, robots don't have to wear masks. That's true. And it's probably part of that. Part of it is this historically tight, well, not historically, but very tight labor market we're seeing. And one thing to note is that so far, the effect of these orders hasn't been seen, and probably it won't be seen for a while. So 60% of these robots are going to automotive companies. So it's going to plants making cars, and it's going to take years to really integrate them into factories. We've had many stories we've covered about robots in other sectors, like fast food, for instance, but those are basically still kind of early stage products that aren't ready for prime time and are just sort of a test phase. So, robots aren't having a different new effect so far. I think a lot of this is just more of the same. But I think this is probably going to put a bit more pressure on startups to develop new robots and new robotics applications to improve the productivity in some of these sectors like leisure and hospitality, where really robotics is not a thing yet.
Yeah, definitely. That's and that's where actually a lot of the workforce is coming back at, and robotics is still really killing it despite that. So huge deal. As a roboticist, Andre, how does this make you feel? Does this make you feel like you want to stay in robotics after your PhD, or what does this look like?
I think it depends really. So this probably for the most part is still trying to automate factories, and that, as you said, is possibly in part due to COVID, because you have more resilient factories with more stuff that's automated, less reliance on humans, and factory jobs are one of the job categories where it's not necessarily easy to find workers. Also, e-commerce is another big one, but a lot of this is, let's say, not all that interesting from a roboticist perspective. It's using big giant robot arms to do a repetitive motion in a production line. So I think it's kind of an interesting economical shift with some major implications. But as a roboticist, I think we're mostly interested in where we can take robotics next in terms of more intelligent robotics that, automates some of the things or helps with some of the things that people that we cannot do yet. So for instance, we've talked about having robots in hospitals, helping out nurses with deliveries and things like that. And there's many companies working on these sort of less, let's say, dumb robots that are just doing the same thing over and over, but actually working alongside people and having to learn and having to perceive environments and so on. But those are still pretty far away, so I don't think they are reflected in this surge in orders. But I do hope that the surge in orders will lead to more funding going to these companies and more kind of interest in developing new robotics, kind of software, hardware, all of that to tackle new applications.
That's right. Yeah. And on to our lightning round. First article is French tax officials use AI to spot 20,000 undeclared pools. So the French tax authorities actually used AI to find thousands of undeclared private swimming pools, which, cost the owners of these swimming pools a total of 10 million euros. And the system, was developed by Google and Capgemini, and they can look at aerial images and be able to identify pools and be able to also cross-check that with the land registry databases to see who owns the pools. So I know it's a small thing, but still, I guess it's enforcing things by air. Next article is AI illuminates permanently shadowed regions on the moon. So with the help of AI, an international research team from Zurich has explored the moon's permanently shadowed regions, and the information they got about the area's surface properties will actually help identify suitable locations for future lunar missions. And that's pretty cool. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean AI can't see it.
And on to the other lightning round stories, we have artificial intelligence can be used to better monitor Maine's forests. So researchers have developed a method using AI to monitor soil moisture to be able to make monitoring more energy and cost efficient. So it learns how to make the best available use of network resources, and that makes it possible to produce more power efficient systems at a lower cost for large scale monitoring. And that's kind of interesting. We've already chatted about other instances where this AI was used for monitoring, wildlife and now forestry we've chatted about. So it looks like for a lot of applications in monitoring and these sort of nature things, we're seeing a lot of stuff. And also, we have Panera Bread tests AI technology in drive-thru lanes. So starting Monday, drive-thru customers at 2 Panera Bread locations in upstate New York will have their orders taken by an AI system in a test of a technology in terms of its accuracy and ability to decrease service times. And this is using OpenCity's voice ordering technology called Tori. This is from a startup that has raised almost $7 million from private investors, and that has already had its technology used by more than 24 restaurants, including at least one Popeyes location in Louisiana. I don't know why the article says that, but it does. So yeah, I guess for, I imagine fast food workers are usually stretched thin and there's a lot of running around and whatnot. So hopefully this makes their lives easier and doesn't lead to job losses, as we often discuss. On to research and advancements. First up, we have UI to decode speech from brain activity from Facebook. So every year, actually, more than 69 million people around the world suffer traumatic brain injury, which leaves many of them unable to communicate through speech, typing, or gestures. I actually didn't know 69 million is a lot. But
that's a lot of people. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, not few of them, hopefully, are not able to communicate, but still. So for those people who could not communicate in traditional means, so for those people who cannot communicate in traditional means, these researchers have tried to develop something that can translate essentially their brainwaves to English words and sentences. And this is obviously not a new problem, or maybe not obviously, but it's been done by neuroscientists for a while. But most of the progress has relied on invasive brain recording techniques such as, well, these are big words that I can't say, but let's say they involve cutting into your brain and whatnot. That's why they're invasive. So this work focuses on non-invasive techniques, so things that you can wear over your skull, for instance, so it doesn't require cutting into you. And these are a lot harder to work with because they are, provide a much noisier signal. But if you could do it, obviously that's pretty nice. So they were able to get a bunch of data and apply some of the kind of newish techniques in self-supervised learning, actually using a technique that was developed by Facebook in 2020, Wave2Vec. And at a high level, it's pretty much just taking brainwaves and taking audio, the spare data, and learning a shared representation to then be able to decode brainwaves into words. And they evaluated on a standard-ish data set and found that it works quite a bit better than any of the previous approaches, which is really cool. So obviously not ready for prime time, but as research advancements, this is pretty exciting. And they leveraged 4 open source EEG and MEG data sets from academic institutions. So that led to more than 150 hours of recordings of 169 healthy volunteers listening to audiobooks and isolating sentences in English and Dutch, which was used for training.
What's crazy cool is that the activations of Wave to Vec 2.0, the algorithm, actually map onto the brain in response to the same speech sounds. And they recently showed that. And then that the representations of the first layers of this algorithm, like the first initial layers, map onto the early auditory cortex specifically of the brain. Whereas the deepest layers actually map onto high level brain regions like prefrontal and parietal cortexes. So I mean, that's really cool that they were able to visually see that and to see kind of what the model was learning through self-supervision. And specifically also using contrastive learning to align speech.
Yeah. So pretty trendy techniques, I guess. But yeah, that's really interesting. And we've seen some work before on these kinds of things where visual representations also map to the brain in some ways, and NLP models. So it's kind of a set of emerging work that shows that AI isn't the same as what we have in our brains, but can correlate pretty nicely to what we have going on in our brain. And just to add a little bit more details, they found that for 3 seconds of brain activity, their model can decode corresponding speech segments with up to 73% top 10 accuracy. So not the best. If you look at the top 10, you're looking at like in the top 10 is one of the words there or not. And 70% on that isn't that precise, but still it might be good enough to communicate. And this is with a vocabulary of 793 words. So not all of English, but pretty much most of the English you need to express common things. So yeah, really cool. And just another way that shows how AI could help people with disabilities and impairments.
Yeah. And they're using some fancy techniques, definitely having clip loss in there for to help with zero-shot classification in the decoder. And then though that being said, there's no transformers, no attention here, largely convolutional. So not all trendy. It's okay. Cool. So the next article is robots can be used to assess children's mental well-being, study suggests. So there's a team of roboticists, psychiatrists, computer scientists from the University of Cambridge that studied 28 children between the ages of 8 and 13 and gave them a humanoid robot and had a standard psychological questionnaire given to them after they interacted with this robot to assess their mental well-being. And what they found was that the children were willing to confide in the robot. They were able to, share various pieces of information versus, the questionnaire. And what was interesting, and I think we've kind of heard this echoed before in previous studies as well that we've covered, is that for children who were not experiencing mental well-being problems, the researchers found that, the robot led to more positive response ratings in the questionnaires. But for children that might be experiencing well-being related concerns, the robot actually enabled them to divulge their true feelings and experiences, and that led to more negative response ratings to the questionnaire. So it's interesting that the robot can really help as a confidant. And I guess they were suggesting, in place of a person, but they also suggested we can't actually fully replace people. But yeah, there we go. Robots.
Yeah, another related area We've chatted a while ago about using robots to help children with autism practice communication patterns. So this is kind of related to that. Just for some reference, the robot here is a pretty cute, small, almost toy-like model. So it's, kind of looks like a toy. It's child-sized and totally non-threatening and a bit cute. So it makes sense that children would like it. And I think, as a non-human, maybe even find it easier to talk to it about whatever is going on, right? There's probably no threat of embarrassment where you're talking to a robot. This study, divided the children into 3 groups, and there was some additional sensors going on. So participants interacted with the robot by speaking with it or touching sensors on its hands and feet. And there was also tracking of heartbeat, head, and eye movement. So there was quite a bit of kind of, a human trial type data here. So, it's quite neat that robots are being found to be useful for mental health, not just as like therapy chatbots, but actual little robots to speak to. And we've talked about related things, not just the autism thing. We've also talked about robot cuddly toys for people with, for elderly people who have loneliness or have dementia problems. So it seems like a really emerging area of seeing how robots can interact with people and help them with their health in places where humans might struggle. And this is, of course, kind of combining humans and robots. So now a therapist could use the information for the robot to then suggest treatment and stuff like that.
That's right. Would you want such a robot?
I've already said this. I want a robot pet. I want a robot puppy or kitten in my house. They're too expensive right now, but one day I will get one and I will probably find it delightful.
I think you would. I think you need one. As a robot, you're not.
Yeah, I don't currently have a pet, so I could use, if not a real pet, I would take a robot pet.
And on to, I'll think about it.
I'll let you play around with my pet.
I'll play with yours first.
Yeah.
Cool. So on to our lightning round. So first is Canadian researchers using machine learning to mitigate effects of climate change. And this article discusses, a few researchers, including Sasha Lucchioni, who joined the MILA, Montreal-based AI Research Center, and was also a founding member of Climate Change AI, an organization of volunteer academics who advocate using AI to solve problems related to climate change. I love Sasha. She's a friend, and she's now at Hugging Face. And I used to also be part of her thing, Climate Change AI.
Oh, yeah, you've worked on it a fair amount too.
Yeah, I did that during my PhD. And it also mentions researchers at the University of Prince Edward Island, UPEI, who are using AI modeling to warn farmers about risks to their crops as weather becomes more unpredictable. Finally, another application of AI studied at McGill University talks about how researchers are using historical and recent weather data to predict the social impact of extreme weather events that are being affected by climate change, such as heat waves, droughts, and floods. So a whole host of work there from Canada doing some social good for climate change.
Yeah, and it really showcases how AI can play a part in dealing with climate change in terms of, dealing with patterns of data and understanding what's going on. Obviously, climate is very complicated, and so AI could be pretty useful there.
Yeah, that's right. Next article is researchers develop TiCoder, framework for code generation using user feedback with 90.4% consistency to user intent. And this article is based on the paper. We're talking about the paper, Interactive Code Generation via Test-Driven User Intent Formalization. And so this is researchers from MSR using the academic code generation benchmark dataset called mostly basic Python problems, MBPP, to test their implementation using test-driven user intent formalization, which basically means with just one user query, TiCoder increased the statistic for code generation accuracy by over 22% by using the OpenAI Codex large language model on the mostly basic Python problems. And for over 90% of these samples, TiCoder also showed that it could provide a non-trivial functional unit test that was in line with user intent in an average of 1.69 user queries, meaning it could just give a unit test immediately and be able to work with that. And so that's pretty cool. We're getting to the point where we're, I guess, trying to automate ourselves here, programming.
Well, this is interesting because they're using user feedback, so it's actually integrating more closely the automation with the human and showing that it improves things a lot. Pretty, unsurprisingly. So, GitHub Copilot is already a big deal, and I'm sure it will keep improving. And this seems to be one work in that line of work. Next up, for our final stories, we have AI improves treatment in women with heart attacks. So heart attacks in women are actually more likely to be fatal than in men. And now researchers have developed a novel AI-based risk score that improves personalized care for female patients with heart attacks. Man, there should be a catalog of all the various applications of AI for healthcare. We've talked about so many already, And last up, we have MIT researchers use machine learning to expedite research on new battery materials. It talks about how Pablo Leon, an MIT graduate student in materials science, is developing a machine learning tool that can help scientists automate one of the most time-consuming but key steps in evaluating battery materials, which is you need to basically simulate them in order to predict their behavior. But building accurate simulations is very difficult, right? Because you need to be very accurate down to the atom level or close to that. So this student is applying a machine learning tool that can speed up building these kinds of simulations without using proprietary models or do any hand tuning. And he has already verified that for some well-studied materials and is presumably going to be applying to other stuff soon. On to policy and societal impacts. First up, we have review finds paucity of robust evidence on impact of AI clinical outcomes. So there was a systematic review of studies titled Randomized Controlled Trials of AI in Clinical Practice, Systematic Review. And it didn't find anything, was not very positive. So even as we found that AI-assisted tools have begun to really, have a place in healthcare, there was a 2020 study finding that there were already 64 FDA-approved devices and algorithms. But this review found that a lot of the research is pretty flawed. So for one, very few of the papers actually use randomized controlled trials, which is where you have two methods and you try to compare them, and you at random in one setting use one thing, in another setting do the other thing, and then you do statistical analysis and show how they compare and avoid researcher bias. And of almost 12,000 articles, only 39 apparently had these randomized controlled trials. And in medicine, of course, this is kind of pretty standard to have randomized control trials. And even in those papers, there were small sample sizes and single center, so like single hospital testing. So in general, the conclusion is the results aren't very robust, even if they're not necessarily wrong. And there needs to be more robust testing to really demonstrate that AI tools actually improve outcomes in practice.
I think this meta review is the systematic meta review is it's very important to kind of take that step back and think about how we really haven't done that many randomized controlled trials. There's a lot of hype in this space. We've done a lot of research in this space, and you hear about it from us all the time, and it's exploding, but the rigor of how we're assessing it is still not getting there yet. It's still not as good as what is required to deploy in many cases. And so I think it's more and more important as we develop this technology, as it matures, to bring it to this next level, which is randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, I think the standard in a lot of these papers is still kind of a standard machine learning thing of have a train set and a test set, right? But ultimately, you do want to. Yeah. Yeah, good numbers are good, but you want to actually test it out in the real world, I think, is the point of this work here.
That's right. Next article is France puts healthcare at the heart of $1.8 billion AI strategy. So this is French President Emmanuel Macron, who's committed $1.8 billion into AI over the next 4 years for France. And they actually are spending, their spending plan will target the healthcare sector. And this is accompanied by a commitment to open up French data, which, for me, all of this is very surprising. So the French leader, he knows that he needs patient data if he wants to be transforming healthcare, if he wants AI to be transforming healthcare. But of course, that data could be dangerous to open up because it could be used by insurers to predict patients' medical risk or exploited for commercial gain without actually improving lives. And Macron does mention that would be a major threat to France as they go down this path. But he also recognizes the downsides, that he sees that he needs to open up data, especially if done properly. It'll be a huge net gain for the French economy and the lives of their citizens. I think this is kind of showing how Europe, we've mentioned a few times, is behind the US and China. And this is a way for France in particular to be able to differentiate themselves and say, hey, the US is having the private sector lead healthcare and also how to define how data is collected. Whereas in China, the state plays a huge role on this topic, while now he sees Europe being a different take, on the values and goals of AI, and that it should be around human progress and not technological progress. And they want to start with healthcare. And so I think this is really interesting to differentiate. And I think it's important for countries to do so. And I'm excited to see what this means for France. And I'm excited to see how this could help them. I would like to see them succeed, or want to see someone succeed at using AI for healthcare. And I'm curious which of these three strategies will. For some reason, I have a feeling it's not the US's strategy.
Yeah, I mean, different strategies lead to different good outcomes. And another thing that's noted here is this ties in nicely to the focus in Europe on ethics and kind of regulating AI. So companies will need to comply with some standards, like making their algorithms open to access these funds. So it's a bit of an initiative or motivation to go along with these values of openness and reliability and so on. And yeah, I think it's, like you said, pretty exciting. $2 billion is a pretty big deal. And it's interesting we don't talk about tech in Europe much. So it'll be cool to see where this goes. And onto the lightning round. First up, we have Clearview glasses with facial recognition are here, and the Air Force is buying. We haven't chatted about Clearview in a bit, so I guess it was about time they showed up again. And yeah, now they're developing to research the use of augmented reality glasses combined with facial recognition for the U.S. Air Force. This is a pretty small contract of just $50,000 and is all about airfields with augmented reality facial recognition, so not like a big application across society. But I'm sure that if Clearview develops these glasses, they're going to try to sell it to police and other sectors. So I guess it's only a matter of time unless we get some regulation on this stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. And speaking of that, we have New York City AI bias law charts new territory for employers. So there's a new law that penalizes employers for bias in AI hiring tools. And companies are actually scrambling to audit their programs before it takes effect in January. So that's, sounds nice in that the companies actually have to know and audit their algorithms to know if they're biased or not, which is what you would hope they would do in the first place.
That's right. But enforcing it doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
Next article is U.S. officials order Nvidia to halt sales of top AI chips to China. So if you haven't heard already, Nvidia said that the U.S. officials have ordered Nvidia to cease exporting two of its top computing chips for AI work in China, which will hamper its business that accounted for $400 million in sales in that current quarter. And that includes A100. So I'm very glad that this means that we can buy them because
these are some pretty high-end GPUs that people use a lot for research. So this was a big story in the AI research world, and is pretty aggressive. Like this is actually going to make an impact on a lot of researchers, and it's pretty aggressive. So I wonder if this is just partially because of the shortages and wanting US researchers to have more access, or if it is also, about this AI race. But yeah, kind of big deal.
I think it's both, right? I definitely think the AI race is part of this. So it's about keeping things within our borders. And it's part of, the Chip Act and everything. And so this was a huge story. And our last lightning round article is UK government releases new AI security guidance, where they basically released new guidance designed to help developers and others root out and fix vulnerabilities in machine learning systems. And that includes, it's a bit high level, but includes reliance on data. Manipulating training data could result in unintended behavior, or, make it easily exploitable. Opaque model logic, which is basically just a black box, challenges verifying models. So it could be impossible to actually verify how well something is doing. And that there could be just so many hits on the model that it's hard to verify each one. Reverse engineering models and training data could also be a threat. And finally, the need for retraining. So many machine learning systems use continual learning to improve their performance, but it needs to be reassessed several times, maybe even per day. But we can't just deploy one model and expect it to always work forever.
Yeah, so this is just a general sort of advice thing, I guess, for info security professionals. So this is from the National Cybersecurity Center, and it's kind of a report. So it's not really policy per se, but I guess it's another demonstration of how, in terms of cybersecurity, machine learning is increasingly a part of that. And onto our last section, the art and fun stuff section, where we just discuss things that are generally, fun and interesting and not depressing at all. Starting with everything's AI-derived raw data field tackles mental health and conspiracy theories. So everything is a band, and raw data field is their latest album, and they used AI partially to create this album. In particular, they used an AI program that generated lyrics for it, and there's a pretty fun interview with the singer of a band about when they decided to do it. He just started messing around with AI-generated text because he was aware of it. And then he wanted to see if it could make lyrics out of the worst, most extreme texts he could find. So he was looking at the terms and conditions of LinkedIn, and then combining that with Beowulf, and then also a little bit philosophy of mysticism, and then it spat out a load of stuff, and I picked out the best bits and tried to write around it or reinterpret it. So it's really only about 7% of lyrics on the record, but it's pretty interesting, and it I'm sure it kind of inspired some of the directions. So yeah, it's another area we've seen some prior bands do this, and there's some songs linked that are pretty fun, and some of it lyrics seem that it might be AI derived. What do you think, Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, the songs are beautiful, I think, and a little bit eerie, and got really good reception from people. And again, this is just, lyrics. This is not actually, it's not generated, it's not sung by the AI, though they did consider doing that, but they felt like it's already an uphill battle with convincing people, this is something they've written, even though the lyrics are AI generated or mostly so. And so I thought this was an interesting article from that perspective.
Yeah, and it shows, I think, another kind of another application of text generation to writing. Famously, last time we talked about stories by AI, our own little effort in that. So I feel like this is probably going to get more common where people, songwriters, and also just general writers augment their process with some AI input, to get over writer's block or just get some ideas. And in the end, it won't make up most of the text, as in this case, but it will be part of the process. So it is kind of notable in showing a more established band that has been around for over a decade. And this is because these techniques are coming out and are pretty easy to use. They just decided to try it out and use some of it for their lyrics, which is interesting.
And our last article is Holly Herndon, How AI Can Transform Your Voice, which is actually on TED Radio Hour by NPR. And this is about how Holly, who earned her doctorate in composition at Stanford, working with the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, has a podcast called Interdependence, where she makes her research process very public. And she actually has been training a machine learning model on her own voice to be translated into Catalan and to sing in that voice in Catalan. So it's very cool. And the podcast basically, showcases a lot of her singing, and she calls her software Holly Plus, which is funny. It can read, notes on sheet music. And so they go through that in the interview and on this podcast. And I also love this other thing that she did, which was someone else did go on stage and sang into a mic. He was holding in his right hand and had a beautiful voice. But then he sang into another microphone held in his left hand. And all of a sudden, it was his voice being adapted into Holly Plus's voice live. And that was really cool in real time. So I thought, performance wise, that was a cool thing to do. And overall, then the interview goes down and starts talking about how, the implications of this work and what it means to be able to be someone else's voice or embody someone else's voice, and what do rights look like around people's voices.
Yeah. So as always, that's kind of an area that people are interested in. And this is interesting. Her music, the previous one is pretty much pop. This is more, let's say, artistic singing. If you listen to the music, it's, let's say, conceptual and a little bit oblique, but you can definitely hear the kind of effect of having these various voices and choruses. And this artist is quite interesting. She's been doing this for a while. So now she has 2 albums out, and this required a fair deal of work. So she trained the machine learning model on hours of her natural singing voice. So this is kind of going beyond what most artists have done, and is more, let's say, technically informed or more technically involved, given her work at Stanford. So yeah, really interesting. And I don't know, maybe I'll, put in the work and embed some music here, or if nothing else, you can go to last week in.ai and find the links to all these articles once again, and also these songs to take a listen.
And our lightning round. So, a LinkedIn marketing agency acquired an AI that writes Mega-Cringe LinkedIn posts. So, a little more than a week ago, a marketer was absolutely delighted, So, a little more than a week ago, a marketer named Tom Orbach made the news on Twitter when he unveiled his LinkedIn, quote, viral post generator, which is a website that uses AI to create viral LinkedIn posts, including cringy ones. And it's pretty hilarious that it does this. Just to, give an example. So first he analyzed, 100,000 posts that had gone viral. And then he, trained the model on this. And as an example, I really admire the people that read my emails in their career. I feel mentally connected with them. They know that nothing is impossible. Nothing else matters. Want my advice? Start your day at 5 a.m. and immediately read my emails. It will change your life. Just make sure you read well and the rest will follow. Hashtag how to be successful. Hashtag influencer. Hashtag LinkedIn. Man, and that got nearly 300,000 votes as of, this article, probably more now, and over 10 million views, which is just... This is just like hilarious.
Yeah, it's hilarious. This is like a simple web tool you can go to. So it has a simple GUI application. You enter what did you do today and inspirational advice. And then you have a little cringe level selector. So you can kind of fine tune how cringy you want it to be. And then it generates a text. And as you said, this has gone pretty viral on Twitter. There's lots of tweets of it. Just another example, there's my secret career hack. Here it is. Simply brush your teeth and sharpen your tongue. Once you manage to do that, you'll get 10x salary. If you need to get started, you can write copy for marketing materials. That's the first step, and it's easy. I too wrote copy for marketing materials and grew from there. It taught me a lot. Go write copy for marketing materials now and share on LinkedIn once you finish. So yeah, definitely great advice. And I will start posting on LinkedIn with this tool. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen, there's pretty good, I really liked on Twitter, there were satire LinkedIn posts. So these feel a little bit like that. And yeah, it's hilarious. And I think I'll play around with it after we finish recording.
I feel like I'm definitely going to play with it too.
Yeah. And for our very last story, the second lightning round, we have an AI-generated artwork won first place at a state fair fine arts competition, and artists are pissed. So a man came in first at the Colorado State Fair's fine art competition using an AI-generated artwork this last week. And this artwork was generated using Mid-Journey, which is one of the kind of cutting-edge techniques you can use out there. This person is Jason Allen, who is actually the president of a Colorado-based tabletop gaming company. And he won in the digital art category with a work titled Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial. Just to paint, verbal image. It's sort of like operatic image in space. So there's these kind of dramatic human figures with a lot of kind of space and planets, and it's quite dramatic. And I would say it looks really good, and I could see it actually doing quite well. And yes, many people on Twitter, many artists then responded very negatively A person tweeted, "We are watching the death of artistry unfold before our eyes." And it became a whole thing on Twitter, and still is being discussed, I think. And, people on Hacker News and Reddit, elsewhere, there was a lot of discussion around this.
I heard the artist community was actually a little bit dismayed by this and annoyed. I guess it's a bit understanding why that is, but it does show that these models are now really taking this by storm. This is pretty fast, actually, from the just writing the initial wave of these models, and so. It's really interesting that this has happened, but it definitely has drawn some criticism from the community and feels hypocritical to some of them.
Yeah,
especially since models are trained on artists' work, real artists' work.
Yeah, and that is another kind of ongoing controversy. These models kind of arguably plagiarizing living artists, but yeah, it's an ongoing discussion. The winner of a prize here gave some comments and argued that actually it took a good amount of work. So he was exploring a special prompt and created hundreds of images and had weeks of fine-tuning and iteration, and then chose the top 3 and printed it on canvas and so on. So it didn't take no work, but it didn't take any skills with painting or drawing, obviously. And some people are saying, well, there should just be an AI-generated category for this competition instead of just digital art. I think that makes a lot of sense. Personally, I think, AI is a tool. You can make art of it. It's not a problem. Maybe for competing, it is a problem because then it's a measure of human skill. But otherwise, it's a pretty nice piece of work. And I don't know what the other entries were, but certainly it seems like nice entry to the competition.
Yeah, and with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at lastweekin.ai.
If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, then go ahead and do that, since you stuck around through this whole episode, apparently. And then if you are already subscribed, then as we said at the beginning, we would really appreciate a review telling us, how this helps you in your career or what you've been learning or finding interesting. We could actually use the feedback to know what to cover and, any ways to improve. But all that aside, just be sure to keep tuning in.